We're going to start talking now about the storytelling animal, which is one of the common texts for Core 179. As you know, one of the questions of Core 179 is what does it mean to be human? And the storytelling animal gives the author, Jonathan Gottschall's answer to that question, which involves, of course, telling stories. We're going to read several chapters of the book in the class, but we're not going to read the whole book, and we're not going to read the first chapter. So we're going to talk about the first chapter now, just to have a summary so everybody's on the same page. One of the activities that Gottschall suggests starting with is looking at a common text together and then answering questions about it. So the text that he has in chapter 1 is an excerpt from a book, a nonfiction book, that tells the story of the real-life ship on which Moby Dick is based. So let's take a look at that excerpt, and then we will talk about it a little bit after that. Here's the excerpt from the book In the Heart of the Sea. Under Coffin's watchful eye, the helmsman brought the ship as close as possible to the derelict craft. Even though their momentum quickly swept them past it, the brief seconds during which the ship loomed over the open boat presented a sight that would stay with the crew the rest of their lives. First they saw bones, human bones, littering the thwarts and floorboards as if the whaleboat were the seagoing lair of a ferocious man-eating beast. Then they saw the two men. They were curled up in opposite ends of the boat, their skin covered with sores, their eyes bulging from the hollows of their skulls, their beards caked with salt and blood. They were sucking the marrow from the bones of their dead shipmates. Okay, now without going back to look at the text, answer these questions. What did Captain Coffin look like? Was he young or old? Did he wear a hat? What kind? What color was his coat? What about his beard? How many men crowded the deck of Captain Coffin's ship? What was the weather like? Was the sky gray or blue? What were the waves like? What were the cannibals wearing? Now, if you're like my students that I've had in face-to-face classes and done this activity with, you might have come up with some descriptions of Captain Coffin. Maybe you think he's wearing a blue jacket, maybe you think he's wearing a tricorn hat or a traditional sailor's hat, or maybe he looks a little bit like Captain Crunch. You might imagine that there are many, many men on the boat when they approach the broken down boat. You might have thought about the weather. Is there a thunderstorm? Maybe the sky is gray, maybe the waves are big. What are the cannibals wearing? Many students answer that the cannibals are wearing rags. But let's take a look at what is actually described in this text. As you can see here, we don't get any physical description of Captain Coffin. We don't know how many men are on his boat. We don't know what the weather's like. We don't know what the waves are like. We don't know if there's a storm. We don't know what the cannibals are wearing. So we imagine a lot of things that aren't actually in a text when we read a text. And the way that Jonathan Gottschall describes this is to say that the writer is not an all-powerful architect of our reading experience. The writer guides the way we imagine, but does not determine it. In other words, one of Gottschall's main ideas in this first chapter is that the reader interjects a lot of meaning on what the reader is reading, and so that we act as co-creators of a story. And the way we understand a story has to do not only with the words on the page, but with the details that our brains and our minds add to the story as we read. Gottschall's main point is that story dominates our lives, and he gives many examples of this. For example, he says that children do story, meaning they don't do much else but act out stories. When they play, they pretend to play at a kitchen set, or they pretend that they're monsters, or they pretend that they're in Star Wars, or they pretend that they're having sword fights. But they do a lot of pretending, and most of the pretending that they do has to do with telling stories. Gottschall also notes that more fiction is sold than all categories of nonfiction, and he takes that to mean that people like story, that we are drawn to story. And he also notes that the nonfiction that is sold is often written in a fictional style, like that excerpt that we looked at just a couple minutes ago. He also says that the non-reading time that we spend is still centered around story. So when we watch TV, when we listen to music, when we watch sports, when we decide what to buy at the store, all of these activities are still very much centered around story. And he says that even when we're not really conscious about it, we're thinking in terms of stories. So we dream stories. During the day, we daydream stories. We imagine story. He says that story is a very central part of what it means to be human. Then Gottschall goes on to talk about the ways that we spend our time that are not specifically directed towards reading stories. And he gives different examples of how stories are prevalent in our lives. For example, he talks about courtroom dramas and really even like a news description of a famous court trial. So he'll talk about how the different parties in a court case will have descriptions written about them and will take sides, and there's a plot around it. And we start to take, in famous trials, we start to take the lawyers and make characters out of them. And we get drawn into the story and invested in who's going to win the trial and who's not. When we listen to music, we are drawn towards music that tells a story. We like music that has plot associated with it. We like learning about characters even within the 3-minute confines of a song. We, of course, like movies, and movies are stories depicted on page. But then he talks also about sports. And one thing he talks about notably is the Olympics. Of course, we all know that, in the couple of months before an Olympic Games, we are inundated with stories about the athletes who raised himself up by his bootstraps, who was born in poverty and became a great athlete, who has had major medical problems and has conquered those, who has had major family difficulties. Even in commercials, we'll see Lowe's and Home Depot and Enterprise Car Rental all talk about how they have had a hand in training these athletes by giving them jobs while they train. Gottschall also talks about professional wrestling and how we all know that it's not real. We all know that it's scripted, but we buy into the characterization and we like getting excited about the characters. And even though we know that it's choreographed, we still watch it because we like the plot associated with the story. And he talks about commercials. He claims that some of the most popular commercials are ones that tell stories. And I remember a commercial a few years ago, before I had kids, for Chef Boyardee, in which the harried mom opened a door and there was a salesperson standing there, and the kids were just going crazy behind her and she didn't know what to do. And then finally she opened up cans of Chef Boyardee and everybody sat down quietly and ate. And before I had kids, I thought, who would ever do that? But now I see myself doing the same thing. So as a mom, now I connect with the story that is told in that commercial. And commercials, of course, tell lots of stories. The commercials for Gatorade, where the athletes are doing their best and great athletic feats and then drinking Gatorade to recover. Or the commercials about sports apparel, that if you wear this, you will be faster. Commercials about coffee, where the soldier comes back in the middle of the night and everybody gets a cup of coffee to celebrate. So there are plots associated with products, and Gottschall argues that since story is such a central part of our lives, we're attracted to these commercials that have story as a big part of them. And the word that Gottschall uses to describe all of this is fiction-y. He says we like things that are fiction-y. We like things that tell stories that are maybe still true, but told in a way that sounds like fiction. Another thing that Gottschall talks about is how we tell stories about ourselves. He notes that a lot of the conversation that we have with our friends and in different groups, and when we gossip and when we tell stories, it's all about telling stories. Somebody says, "How was your day?" And you might say, "Fine," but you might say, "Oh, it was awful. I dropped my keys and then I couldn't get into my car and then I got stopped at a light and then I ran out of gas." And so you will tell the stories about what happened in your day instead of simply relating the events of the day. He also notes that the stories that we tell about ourselves, particularly in terms of memoir and autobiography, are based a great deal on memory. And when we talk about the memories that we have in our lives, what we're doing is we're taking the things that we remember and shaping them into story. And as we all know, some of the memories that we have of our early childhood or of things that happened long ago are extremely faulty. If we ask our parents about what life was like or about a major event when we were kids, we might have remembered details that are different from the way it actually happened. So basing any kind of memoir or autobiography or anything that is meant to be factual on memory is bound to have a fictional aspect to it as well. Gottschall claims the memories that we use to form our own life stories are boldly fictionalized. And we're going to talk later on in the course about whether or not this is true. Can we tell stories about our own lives that are true, or will we always be fictionalizing our lives when we try to base stories on memory? So the major question that Gottschall ends this first chapter with is, what is fiction for? And as you read the rest of the chapters in the Storytelling Animal that we'll be reading in this course, that's the question I want you to consider. Every chapter has an answer to that question. Gottschall gives different answers to that. So keep considering, what is fiction for, and how does the fact that humans like fiction relate to what does it mean to be human?